Hello all you scat cats! I hope you're all doing wonderfully. Here is another episode of the top 10 favorite and from what I believe are the absolute best performances of some of the greatest actresses ever. You guessed it! I am starting from 10 and then working my way up to number 1, and yes, ladies and gentlemen, I have seen every film that is attainable of these actresses, so these lists are joyously accurate. Now, I am very excited to talk about one of the more underrated artists that has ever graced the stage, television, and cinema. The lovely Ruby Dee. Born in Cleveland, but raised in Harlem, New York, she actually got her college degree in Romance languages. Nice. She was inspired at a young age to pursue theater, and she joined the American Negro Theater, working with Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte. And it was not long until she met the amazing Ossie Davis, who would be her second and final husband for 57 years until Davis's death in 2005. Very notably, in 1965, she became the first black actress to play the great Shakespearean roles of Kate in The Taming of the Shrew and Cordelia in King Lear for the American Shakespeare Company. She had such amazing abilities where Hollywood was seeing her work on stage and immediately gave her offers for films. Of course, work was still very limited in those days for black artists, unfortunately, and the work they would get in Hollywood was just usually diminishing. But thanks to her and Ossie's independent spirit, and many players who were working alongside them, they all teamed up to create their own work, which was incredible. Her body of work is ginormous. There were so many to narrow down here, it was ridiculous, but that just goes to show the true artistry and consistency of this woman. Once again, I'm only covering films and made-for-TV films, no miniseries or TV show appearances, just because, guys, I specialize in film, come on. As much as I do admire great television, don't get me wrong, but do you guys realize how much television that would be? My goodness. I do have to give a personal shout out to Ruby Dee's breathtaking performance as Mama Abigail in the original 1994 miniseries of Stephen King's The Stand. Because I actually read The Stand, and her performance as Mama Abigail is just spot on and divine. Ruby Dee was such a true artist through and through, and that's why I'm excited to share the top 10 best performances of the great Ruby Dee. Starting off at number 10, we have The Balcony, which was a film adaptation of a French, very avant-garde and strange play. This is such a great experience of a film for actors and artists, I must say. It's about the erotic fantasies being satisfied in a brothel ran by Shelley Winters in a foreign country, it's never really disclosed, while a revolution is going on outside. All characters are general, but it's very much a power play, giving the political statement of where power goes in everyday lives. Ruby Dee's character's name is Thief, one of the brothel girls, and she is featured in a scene where she is being punished by a judge. It's not graphic or anything like that. It's very suggested and metaphorical, which the whole film is an allegory. But man, did Ruby Dee steal that scene with such intensity, and it is absolutely deserving of this spot at number 10. Number 9. Pearly Victorious, or I guess called Gone Are the Days, which, once again, why is it called Gone Are the Days? I still don't know. Anyway, Dee is reprising her role that was written for her and originated by her on Broadway. She plays Ludibelle Gussie Mae Jenkins, Ossie Davis' sidekick and fiancé, to help take down the local slave owners, but more so inspire and uplift the slaves and workers there to stand up for themselves. Her performance as Ludibelle is so precious in the most loveliest of ways because of how she looks up to Pearly and how much she develops a great independence. There's a great conflict where Ossie Davis's Pearly is told that Ludibelle has been taken by the slave owner for his own personal selfish passions, which then infuriate Pearly, obviously, and when we see Ruby Dee give her next monologue, we can see how she can manipulate gravity for us to hang on with her. Ruby Dee and Ossie Davis together have often said their performances in this film were their favorite, which is just so lovely. Number 8, Taking Back Our Town. A made-for-TV movie starring Ruby Dee, who is recruited by a serious mother concerned for her children and her community when a chemical plant plans to build more factories in their hometown. The pollution obviously causes more problems than what the corporation believes. Shocking, right? With Ruby Dee's help, they plan to protest, combat, and fight with all their might despite the obstacles to simply take back their town. This was actually based on a true story, which happened in Convent, Louisiana, and this film really surprised me. The other lead performance by Laura Innes is so genuine, and is that Chris Bauer from True Blood as her husband? Wow! But Ruby Dee cracks the whip with such confidence and power. I love her in this film, and I'd recommend checking this one out. Number 7, It's Good to Be Alive. Another made-for-TV film based on a true story of Roy Campanella, a Brooklyn Dodger who was the first black catcher of the MLB, who becomes unfortunately paralyzed due to a car accident, and the journey of his will to repair himself from the inside out. Ruby Dee plays his wife, who does her best to be supportive, as hard as it is, because in her perspective as the character, taking care of him is her life now. And what life does she have left now? It's really a beautifully layered performance, as Ruby Dee can show compassion and yet show actions of selfishness that I believe it was such a role she could really sink her teeth into. She's not a very sympathetic character at all, and she drives a lot of the conflict between she and Paul Winfield, who plays Campy. It has its cliched and cheesy moments, of course, but it is absolutely one of the best TV films I have seen, and one of the best from Ruby Dee. Number 6, Decoration Day. Yet another great made-for-TV film based on a novella starring James Garner as a retired judge in Georgia, living out his retirement with his housekeeper, played by Ruby Dee, until he's interrupted with convincing his dear friend to accept the Medal of Honor, which his friend is refusing. The reasons become clear over the course of the film, but we also have a subplot of a romantic relationship developing that keeps us fascinated through the backdrop of a patriotic theme. Yes, indeed, Hallmark all over the place, but what's usually the major thing that saves these Hallmark movies? It's the performances, right? Ruby Dee is wonderful in her Emmy-winning performance for Best Supporting Actress here, and it's clear to see why. She always gives the character such a genuine direction, which is why it's so great to watch her here. Number 5, Having Our Say, the Delaney sisters' first 100 years. The inspiring and groundbreaking story that was compiled by reporter Amy Hill Harth, who built a strong relationship with Sadie and Bessie Delaney, sisters who were born in the late 19th century and have become pioneers in the civil rights movement. The articles transitioned into a New York Times best-selling book, and then to a Broadway play, and then to this made-for-TV film. Diahann Carroll and Ruby Dee play the 100-year-old sisters chronicling their story through flashbacks, which is very inspiring. Diahann Carroll and Ruby Dee work so well together, and you wouldn't doubt that they embody women who are 100 years old. Not to mention the great makeup work, but also keep in mind, Ruby Dee was actually 13 years older than Diahann Carroll, and they're supposed to be the same age. Ruby Dee exemplifies such wisdom as Sadie Delaney, that as the film progressed, I was so touched by how their relationship was building. And hey, that's one of my acting teachers! By the time we got to the ending, I was a blubbering mess. In such a good way. If you ever get the chance to see this film, please do. It is such a heartfelt film with beautiful performances. Number 4, Jungle Fever. An underrated modern classic from Spike Lee, in my opinion. I've touched on this before with Ossie Davis, but you have to remember an amazingly memorable performance from Ruby Dee in this film. She plays Ossie Davis's wife. Shocking, right? Lucinda Purify, who does her absolute best to defend both of her children, but at the same time save them from total destruction. Yes, I will talk about that climactic scene featuring Ossie Davis, Samuel L. Jackson, and a heartbreaking Ruby Dee. I won't spoil it, but step by step, the escalation of the tension just increases and increases, and then boom, punches you right in the gut in such Spike Lee style. Ruby Dee has just a masterful ability to embody hysteria and can show a woman crumbling to pieces with such grace and empathy. By the end of the climactic scene with these three players, I don't know about you, but I am just blown away. Please, see Ruby Dee's work in this film. You won't regret it. Number 3, American Gangster. Amazingly and yet unfortunately, Ruby Dee's only Academy Award nominated performance for Best Supporting Actress here. She rounds out an already engaging and all-star cast featuring Denzel Washington as real-life gangster Frank Lucas and his rise to power with smuggling and selling his blue magic in Harlem. Denzel is absolutely amazing as Frank Lucas. And what made me like the character was not his confidence, not his choice of suits, even though they're awesome, but his mother, played by Ruby Dee. You see, in the beginning, we, as the moral audience, we are always against crime, right? I certainly hope so, anyway. But it is until we meet Denzel's mother that we see how much of a breath of goodness there must be in him. We see that he has bought his mother a house with his fortune, and we see the sweetness that his mother has very much, and which reminded me of the relationship between Joe Pesci and Catherine Scorsese, who played his mom in Goodfellas. It's just an effective combination of a sweet, loving mother who has a violent, killer gangster of a son. You think, how is this possible? But that is what humanizes a brutal villain, and Ruby Dee gave us so eloquently that performance of a loving, dear, caring mother. Of course, we all remember the slap scene, where she cries out, "Don't lie to me!" It hits you so suddenly that it stops us in our tracks. Ruby Dee indeed deserved that nod because she was way overdue. But she frickin' rocks the role that was made for her, and I don't think anyone else would be as effective in this role as she was here. Number 2, Do the Right Thing. God, do I love this movie. Working with her hubby, Ossie Davis, and Spike Lee, Ruby Dee delivers such a powerhouse performance as Mother Sister, the self-appointed neighborhood watch. She indeed acts as a mother-like character to both Mookie and his sister Jade, and practically enemy to Demea. Their relationship together in this film is just gold. I love the banter between Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee in this movie. So many memorable moments, including the very first exchange. "You are ugly enough. Don't stare at me. The evil eye doesn't work on me. Mother Sister, you've been talking about me for 18 years. What have I ever done to you? You a drunk fool, besides that." And it goes on and on and on. But the ending with these two is so beautiful. We can tell Spike Lee genuinely had so much fun writing these characters' progression through this story. Also in this film, we see a power from Ruby Dee I personally have not seen a lot from her. And I remember first seeing her in this movie when I was like 16. And I was just blown away. It's inspirational how true artists like Ruby Dee chose to work with up-and-comers at that time, like Spike Lee, because it just shows you she didn't care about fame and all that. She cared about the work and the projects that spoke a message, stories that can impact you. Like this one really impacted me. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Do the Right Thing is one of my absolute favorite films ever, and all parties involved with this film attribute to that, with Ruby Dee remaining one of the more honorable players of this film, giving her all to this performance. Now, as tough as it was, because there are so many, but here are a couple of honorable mentions. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, the made-for-TV film of the iconic and impactful autobiographical book by Maya Angelou, with Ruby Dee playing the role of Grandmother Baxter. The moment when Ruby Dee enters as Grandmother Baxter, she owns the screen. I love the moment with all of her helpers offering her a light for her cigarette at the same time, and she takes it with such control and sass. It's great. Uptight, which was Ruby Dee's only screenplay credit. I'm sure she's had other uncredited screenplay roles, but anyway, here you have Ruby Dee playing a wreck of a mother desperate for welfare and on drugs, while one of her lovers is looking to portray a couple of revolutionaries during the Black Panther civil rights movement. This film is flippin' powerful. It basically acts as a remake of John Ford's original The Informer, which, in retrospect, inspired Infernal Affairs, which then Infernal Affairs inspired The Departed, which is kind of a circle of life, right? The circle of life. Sorry. But this film takes place with the immediate aftermath of the assassination of MLK. It is utterly epic, with Ruby Dee turning in a powerful performance, but her writing here is really, really great, with the great Jules Dassin directing it efficiently. Captive Heart, the James Mink story, starring Louis Gossett Jr. as James Mink, a successful free businessman in Canada who has a white wife and a black daughter. His daughter gets married to another white businessman, but then unexpectedly and immediately sold off as a slave and transferred down south. Yes, this film gets flack for its cheesiness and for twisting the truth because this was based on a true story, right? But Ruby Dee gives such a wonderful performance as another slave who works on the plantation with Mink's daughter. Mink's daughter falls in love with Ruby Dee's son, who's also on the plantation, and the moment when Ruby Dee sees her son almost approaching death, oh, the tears. Steam, a really, really low budget and independent film, with Ruby Dee being the best thing about this film. She plays Doris, who is a lonely widower who has avoided everything in her life, especially church, until she meets a man played by Dick Anthony Williams, who is also really wonderful. And then their relationship sparks a whole new awakening for her. Her moments of tenderness speak so truthfully that we want to wrap our arms around her over and over again in this film. She is wonderful. To be young, gifted, and black. This was a made-for-TV film presentation of the writings and autobiographical play of the amazing and famed playwright Lorraine Hansberry, with Ruby Dee playing multiple characters, but chiefly the mature age of Lorraine Hansberry during her journey of writing the masterpiece and groundbreaking play, A Raisin in the Sun. This was such a fun film, which features Al Freeman Jr., and whoa, is that Blythe Danner and Roy Scheider in this film? But Ruby Dee gives such a lovely performance. Speaking of which, at number 1, A Raisin in the Sun. This, ladies and gentlemen, is honestly the definitive performance for Ruby Dee, in my opinion. Bringing the same role she originated on Broadway to film, she is exquisite as Ruth Younger, the loving, giving, and yet lonely, bitter young wife of Walter Lee, played by Sidney Poitier. Living in the slum apartments in South Chicago, Walter, Ruth, and their son, along with Walter's mama and sister, struggle for money. Walter works a humiliating job he can't stand. Ruth has lost dreams. Walter's sister, Benitha, wants to find a man with options. And Mama cares for the future of her family. And everything seems like it's going downhill. Until an insurance payout over the death of the patriarch comes into the family's hands. And it's looking like a better future is on the way. But Mama has the say in what to do with the money, and not Walter, which crushes his confidence again. The tension increases over its course, and I won't spoil it because you need to see this 100%. That's not up for debate. This Tony Award-nominated play was the first play to be brought to Broadway, written by a black female playwright, and potentially the first homosexual black female playwright. The debate on that continues, so don't quote me on that. But what Lorraine Hansberry constructed here is one of the greatest masterpieces ever to enter theater. Needless to say, the film does 100% justice, having the whole cast reprise their roles. Everyone is just at their A game. But yes, the glowing star is Ruby Dee. From the very start when she enters, her body language gives us so much that we already are attracted to her. We can feel the long hours and the days of bitterness and doing the best she can for her whole family. And when the insurance comes, the dream of buying a house lifts her spirit to the sky. She is so radiant with joy. And my point is that every action, every expression, and every word she gives, there is weight and meaning to it. Her character of Ruth, to me, is one of the more heartbreaking characters in theater. Ruby Dee's only accolade for her role here was the National Board of Review for Best Supporting Actress. And talk about being snubbed, people. Every time I see this film, she sticks out as one of the greatest, and I will never, ever forget this one. Despite being such a working actor, poet, playwright, loving wife, and mother, she and Ossie still made time to propel the civil rights movement, working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, doing benefits, the whole works. As was also shared in Ossie Davis's video, which you can find right here in this playlist for actors, okay? They both earned the National Medal of Arts in 1995, the Kennedy Center Honors in 2004, but also a Grammy for Best Spoken Word Album on their book that they wrote together with Ossie and Ruby, In This Life Together. When she passed away on June 11, 2014, a revival of Raisin the Sun was playing on Broadway, starring Denzel Washington. And of course, the lights were dimmed, prayers were given, and hearts were melted, as she was such an artist that the world can be grateful to have had. I hope you do see more films of this woman, as she will be a pioneer of Black theater, film, and art that will live on for generations to come. That's a wrap, ladies and gentlemen. Please share if you agree with my list, and what are some of your favorite performances by this amazing artist. Please, 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 please list in the comments below. I'd love to hear all your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, more importantly, to stay updated. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and remember, stay positive, productive, and healthy, ladies and gentlemen, because Mother Sister always watches.